Sylvia Scott, the founder and creative director for the Girls CEO Connection, Girls Creating Enterprising Organizations in the United States. And today I have the pleasure of speaking with Emma Biggs, who is in Toronto, Canada. And this is new for us because we haven't had anybody from Canada yet. So I'm excited to have Emma. She is 16 years old, is a gardener, a podcaster, an author, a speaker, a blogger, a radio program host, co-host, and she has written, well, she also sells the tomato seeds online. So she's a real entrepreneur in a lot of different ways. And I forgot she's a blogger. So the radio program is monthly live, and it's called Food Garden Life on Reality Radio 101. And it's with Emma and her father, and they're speaking with guests about creative food gardeners. And Emma's passion is growing tomatoes, trying new and unusual crops, and saving seeds. And she's raised over 150, mind you, 150 tomato versions, which I never even knew there were 150 tomato versions. I didn't ever knew there were 10 tomato versions in her Toronto garden at home, and loves to try weird and wonderful plant projects. So, Emma, how did you get into gardening and going from gardening into trying weird and wonderful plant projects? So how did you get into gardening, and what brought on this wonderful plant projects that you do?
Yeah, so it really started with my dad, and there's no specific event that I can think of when it started. But because he writes about gardening for a living, he's always had me outside in the garden. And so I basically grew up out there, and it was something I loved and I enjoyed, because when I was little, he didn't make me do things like weeding. He let me do things that I enjoyed as a little kid. So he let me pick tomatoes and plant things and just have fun. And so as I got older, gardening was a big part of my life, and it's something I loved. But the day that it really became a bigger part was when I met one of my good friends, Linda Craigo, who owns an heirloom tomato farm. And that day I learned that there are more than 10,000 tomato varieties out there. And she showed me some of the really weird ones, like a purple and white tomato and brown tomatoes and dwarf tomatoes. And just seeing that amazing variety made me say, okay, I want to grow all these. And so that's kind of when my gardening took another step up, and I decided, okay, I want to do more of this on my own. And I really took over more of the garden for myself.
Wonderful. That's great. And there were purple tomatoes and blue tomatoes.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah, there's some really cool ones out there.
That's pretty amazing. Well, the podcast started in 2018, and you were 12 years old. Now, is that when the radio program started at the same time?
Yeah, so we actually started with the radio program. And so one of our friends was doing the radio about gardening. And so she invited us on. And so we went out to the studio with her, and we sat down. We had a really fun conversation, and we both loved doing radio. And so after that, we started seriously considering, okay, maybe we should do this ourselves, because I think Dad had been thinking about it. And then we ended up doing just that. And then during COVID, we started actually podcasting on top of that. So the radio show before was once a month, and afterwards it would go out as a podcast. But now, especially during COVID, we did the podcast once a month, and then we also started podcasting twice a week on top of that. And so it was first the radio show and then the podcast, but our lives are busier now. We're only podcasting once a week, but still, it's something that I really love to do.
So now, how's it now? Was it okay? So now you were 12 when this all started. So you spent.
I mean, I don't remember how old I was, but I'll take your word for it.
I figured it out.
Okay.
If you're 16 now, I went backwards. I figured it out. So that's quite a lot for a 12-year-old. And then over the years, getting better with public speaking, and now you are a public speaker with live and Zoom events. And how does that feel? Because I know most teenagers would not be able to do that unless they were drama majors.
Yeah, well, the thing is, I'm an introvert and I'm shy and I don't love standing up in front of people. I really don't like doing it at school. It's hard to get me to do that, but I think when you're talking about something that you love, it becomes a whole lot easier. So I can stand in front of a room of people and talk about tomatoes for an hour easily because I love it. And I know it pretty well. And I'm really enjoying sharing that information. And yes, it is still really nerve-wracking. I get butterflies every time, but I mean, I enjoy it. And I think that's kind of my job, is to share this passion that I have and hopefully get other people to be excited about gardening as well.
I think so too. I agree with you on that. So you never took a public speaking course?
No, I mean, my dad does it. And so I kind of picked up cues from him. And also now, because I do it, whenever I see someone else talk, whether it's in real life, whether it's on the news, I'm like, oh, look at what they're doing. And I try to take a few tips from other people too.
Good idea. That's a great idea. So your book, Gardening with Emma, you were 13 when you wrote that. Now,
Yeah.
how is that for a 13-year-old to spend her time writing a book and you're so enthralled with the tomatoes and being out in the garden, but then you're writing a book. So how was that? And how long did it take?
Yeah. So it was published when I was 13, and we started working on it maybe 2 years before that. And so writing a book with a publisher is a very long process, from making it happen to actually planning it out, and then the writing and design, finally the printing. It's a very long process. But luckily, because I was really young then, I mean, I guess I'm not that much older now, but dad took over a lot of the business part of it. So I didn't have to, figure out what's happening with the publisher. I could just sit down and I could write and I could help brainstorm ideas. And so I think as a 13-year-old, it wasn't too bad for me because I could just write and do the parts that I enjoyed and I could actually do. Um, but yeah, I mean, it was a lot of work, but I think it was worth it and I really enjoyed doing it.
Are you going to do another one?
I don't know. I'm not sure. I mean, I love to write, but I never find time to do it. But I mean, I have lots of gardening ideas I'd love to share. So hopefully sometime in the future.
So now that you're 16, where do you see yourself in a year and then in 2 years when you'll be getting out of high school? So say next in a
As
year, or you should be getting, are you getting out in when you're 17 or 18?
um, I'll be 18,
Okay.
year
So
and a
where do you
half.
see this going?
I have no idea. And I'm asked that a lot now because I'm supposed to start thinking about it and figuring out, what do I want to do for my life? And I'm not totally sure at what I want to do, but I do know that I love gardening and I love waking up in the morning and going out to the garden and planting tomatoes and harvesting and then writing and doing things like this. And so if I could do this for the rest of my life, I would be pretty happy and I'd love to wake up every day. And so I think that's where I want to see myself in the future, and that's what I'm working towards.
Great. So, well, in the pandemic, of course, worked in favor for you with the gardening, of course. So how did you, I read somewhere your garden is just not like, is it in your, how did you make your garden? And how do you do this when you've got so many different varieties of tomatoes? How big a piece of property are you talking about?
Yeah. So we live in Toronto, so we do live in an urban setting, but our neighborhood has a couple streets that have abnormally long lots. I think they were allocated for World War II veterans, but we have one and it's 300 feet deep by 50 feet wide. So I think that's about a third of an acre, which is really massive for living in the city of Toronto. And so we have a whole bunch of gardens around the property. We have a front yard garden, which my dad mostly does with ornamentals, but we also have a few different areas in the back that are turned into gardens. We have some big raised beds, which for people who aren't familiar, just big like wooden boxes that fill with soil that we can grow in. We grow in containers on our garage rooftop, and it's great up there because it gets really hot. So plants that love the heat do really well. And then every year we try a few other things too. So we've grown in straw bales on the driveway before and done lots of other projects just to try and fit more and more plants into the small space, because it's always, I'm competing with my dad for trying to fit in everything that we want to grow. And it's hard. We always want more growing space, but we make do with what we have.
Yeah, what are ornamentals? Tell people what ornamentals are.
Yeah. So when I say ornamentals, I mean plants that you grow because they're showy and they're pretty. and they're nice to look at. And so when a lot of people think of gardens, that's what they think of. But the gardening that I do is mostly growing edible plants. So vegetables and fruit, of course, lots of tomatoes. And my dad does the same thing. He also does fruit trees. And so that's kind of our focus is on the edible plants. And that's mostly what the backyard is.
So now the edible plants, what else do you grow? Because I thought maybe you were just doing tomatoes, but now it sounds like you're doing other plants. So what other plants are you growing?
I grow a little bit of everything. You name it, and if we can grow it here, I probably grow it from peppers. We grow eggplants. I don't like them, but Dad does. To beans and peas, beets, radishes, kale, Swiss chard, cauliflower, everything you can think of. Flowers, some edible flowers that you can grow. My dad grows lots of figs and citrus trees. And so it's a little bit of everything. And I think I take the most joy out of those tomatoes, but I love being able to go to the garden and pick some beans for dinner and eat lots of other fresh veg from the garden as well.
Now, speaking of so I'm just thinking about all the tomatoes and the varieties. On your radio show, you've had a segment and you may not, I don't know if you're doing it so much now, but called Emma's Tomato Talk. So now, what's Emma's Tomato Talk all about? I mean, I know you're talking about tomatoes, but when you say tomato talk, I think about tomatoes talking. I think of cartoons and tomatoes dancing and talking. So, what's involved with Emma's Tomato Talk?
Yeah, so when we originally started the radio show, we wanted to have a segment where I could just talk about tomatoes because obviously I love them. And there are some really cool people out there doing cool things with tomatoes. So people who save tomato seeds, people who know of cool tomato varieties, people who breed new tomato varieties. And I wanted to talk to them. And so basically I would call them up for a couple minutes and talk with them, and that would go on the radio show. And so it's kind of an excuse for me to get to talk about tomatoes every time we had the radio show, even if our main guest was someone else. And so we did that for a while. We do it every now and again still, but we always make sure that we do include tomatoes in the conversation. So if our guests grow tomatoes, I ask them what's their favorite variety, or sometimes we'll have on really cool tomato breeders on the show and things like that. So I love working that into the show and the podcast.
So now, how much influence do you have on bringing on the tomato breeders and the people that are growing tomatoes compared to your other guests? How do you do that? That's a real mixture. So how do you work on that? And is it all by your dad, or does he let you decide, or how does that come about? Because you're actually producing, you're a producer of a radio show. So that's you've got quite a list of things that you do. So what is it? How is that?
Yeah, well, I mean, I have to pass those producer credits off to my dad because he does most of it. I don't really have time, but we do often sit down and we talk about, oh, I've seen this person doing this and this person doing this. We should have them on the show. And we have a whole list of people that we want to have on the show. And I do the same with tomatoes. I see someone doing something cool and we're like, oh, we should have them on. And then I think the hard part is not talking to them. That's the fun part. And what I love about the podcast is that it's an opportunity for us to call up really cool people that we love and we might not get a chance to talk to otherwise. And so afterwards, after we talk to them, my dad edits it and puts it up as a podcast. And so he does a lot of the editing stuff and pre-planning because I don't have time for that. But we kind of work together and figure out, okay, who do we want to talk to and how can we get them on the show?
Okay, so tell me, what are some of these weird and exciting tomato projects that you've done?
Well, I think the big one is just I'm trying to grow as many tomato varieties as I can. And so every spring I go to different seed events and I swap with people and I order from seed companies and I look for really neat tomato varieties. And so I look for ones that look unusual. I look for ones that apparently they taste really good, unusual foliage. Sometimes I'll get like a tomato that has like a slight fuzz on the skin or weird colors, things like that. And I love trying that. One thing I'm excited about trying this year is grafting tomatoes. And I've never done that before, but I've been looking forward to it. And I got my hands on some grafting clips. So that's going to be fun. And then a future project I'd like to tackle is some tomato breeding. So the only thing I need to do that is some more backyard space.
So tell everybody what's the tomato grafting? Is that what you were saying? So what's
Yeah.
that?
So it's the same idea as with grafting any other plant. It's basically taking two plants, often different varieties, and putting them together. So you'll choose varieties that you think will do well together. So often you have a bottom rootstock plant, so a plant that's known for doing well in that department, and then a tomato that is supposedly really strong and good at producing tomatoes, good flavor, vigor, things like that as the tomato that goes on the top. And so you basically make a cut and you put a grafting clip on, you put them together, let it heal, and then you have a tomato plant with two different plants that are put together, but it'll grow as one plant. And so often commercial tomato growers will do that because you get more vigor from a plant. But what I'm kind of hoping to try is grafting them in a way so that the single plant will produce more than one variety. And so not just having a tomato with a different rootstock, but that will actually produce, purple tomatoes and yellow tomatoes side by side. So we'll see if I can pull that off, but I'm looking forward to giving it a try.
And all of this really helps you in school. I'm listening to you talk about the yellow tomato and the purple tomato and the grafting, and that must help you in science classes. I can't imagine that it wouldn't. I mean, this must really make a difference with your class schedule. I mean, with your classes and your grades. Kind of like they talk
Yeah,
about music is a great way. It sounds like gardening, and what you're doing more than just gardening is great with your classes to help you make great grades.
yeah. I mean, I don't do a ton of in science class. We're doing a little bit about genetics now, which I find really interesting, and so that's great. But often the part of gardening that I'm interested in is like, okay, how do you train this tomato and how do you plant it? And that's not really something that you get into at school. You really dive down into the molecular level. I really wish they taught people more about, how do plants grow on a larger level. But anyway, it is nice to learn a little bit about that at school and have a bit of background knowledge. But I think the biggest thing I've noticed is my public speaking skills is I can go in English class now and give a presentation and my butterflies in my stomach will still go crazy. But I think it's improved since I started for sure.
That's great. What do your friends think about this? And then your teachers, how do they, how do your friends respond with all of this now?
Yeah, well, I think they think it's cool. None of them are super avid gardeners like I am, but I do encourage them, to grow a few things and I give them fresh produce from the garden. And I think that's their favorite part. If I go over to their house with a box of tomatoes and ground cherries and fresh veg, they're going to be pretty happy. And so I just kind of, push them towards trying to get them to grow a bit more and, appreciate where food comes from.
What do your teachers found? What do they think about all this?
Actually, not many of my teachers know,
Oh,
which I'm kind of
really?
happy about. It's kind of like my little secret, and I live two different lives. One of my teachers found my book. Well, she's not my teacher, but she's a teacher at my school. And she found my book, and so she came up to me and said, "Hey, my son really loves your book." And so that was kind of cool. But I don't really like the attention, so they don't know, and I'm okay with that.
What what advice though would you give to another girl if she was thinking about, say, starting a podcast or writing a book, doing things that you have done? Would you say she was 14, anywhere between the ages of 14 and 16? Would you tell her to hold off? Would you tell her to wait, or should she just go for it? What's your advice after
I
with
would
your
definitely just
experience
say
of it?
Yeah, I would definitely just say go for it because it's something that you get better at over time. Your first interview, your first talk is not going to be perfect. I know mine weren't. I don't even want to think about that. But if you do it a lot, you're going to get better. Like now I can sit down in front of the computer and do this, and I don't have to think about it too much. And I can do the radio show and I feel ready. I feel excited about it and I have less butterflies. And it's just something that, the more you do it, the better you're going to get. And whether it's giving a presentation, whether it's writing, whatever it is, you're going to get better at it the more you do it. So just start. And as you do it, reach out to cool people who are doing things that you want to do. Maybe try to learn some things from them and just keep at it. Sometimes it takes time and it takes work to get where you want to go, but just keep trying and you'll get there.
Good advice. Well, Emma, thanks so much. I appreciate it.
Thanks. Have a nice night.
You too.